Borda. My name is Claudia Frost, and I'm an associate landscape architect with Land Studio. I have over 20 years experience in landscape, urban design, and planning, with a particular focus on connectivity and landscape strategy projects. I have a Bachelor of Science degree in Environmental and Public Health from East Carolina University, and a Master's in Landscape Architecture from Clemson University, and I'm a licensed landscape architect in the USA, as well as being chartered in the UK. Land Studio is a leading multidisciplinary landscape architecture and environmental design practice based in Chester in North Wales and working throughout the UK. So, first impressions. Let me just kind of talk to you about when I first arrived in the UK, which was now nearly 6 years ago. I sort of encountered an environment where there was a real lack of understanding about what landscape architects can do. And I became a bit frustrated in a lot of those meetings. Now, I was in London, and it is possible that it's slightly different in London than in the rest of the UK. I've only been up here in North Wales for about 6 months. So, it is quite a formal atmosphere in a lot of the London projects, and there's always a large raft of consultants on nearly everything. So people are quite segregated into their different disciplines. But I felt that, for example, I encountered people who describe themselves as urban designers, and I'm well used to being considered an urban designer. And in fact, I feel that that's one of my areas of expertise. And it was a bit kind of shocking to me to be kind of pushed to the side and said, well, you're not an urban designer, you're a landscape architect, and so you're just going to do this one little thing. And I'm quite used to kind of doing almost everything on a lot of these projects in terms of site analysis and all that. I'm going to go into that in more detail. But basically, my impression was that in the States, every project that I've ever worked on that was kind of urban in scope was led with the landscape and with site analysis. And so that was quite interesting to me to come here and find that I felt like I was being pushed aside a bit. So let's go through some of the kind of definitions, just to refresh me. I feel like I'm a bit preaching to the choir in a lot of ways, so you probably know a lot of this already, but in the States, we call it LID, low impact development, but it's basically the exact same thing as SUDS. So the similarities between the two definitions are they're both about kind of a natural systems approach, and they both focus on keeping water on site or as close to the source as possible. And then looking at sort of the larger context, a watershed and a catchment are the same thing. And both of these approaches, when you look at the bigger watershed or catchment area, are about slowing the flow of the water across that area. So I want to take you back in time to 1969 when Ian McHarg, you're probably familiar with him and his work, but he's a landscape architect who came up, actually I think he's a geographer, but he wrote this book, which is very relevant to landscape architecture, and really kind of focused on analyzing the layers of a site and really taking site analysis before design development. And landscape architects are trained to do this. We're trained to look at all these different layers of the site and analyze them together to come up with the best locations on the site particularly for development and for not development. And so one of the things that I discovered here was that often landscape architects are brought in quite late on projects, and the architect and the client have probably gone to the site and come up with these wonderful ideas and kind of are off and rolling, and have actually spent quite a bit of money at that point, but haven't taken into account things like flood zones and sewer lines and all these things. So the layers of the site, utilities and services, topography, existing trees, flood-prone areas, soil types, all these things have to be taken into consideration before you start planning where you're going to put buildings. And this is becoming more and more and more important now. So this due diligence is something that I'm well used to doing on the site. And it was, in fact, my responsibility as the landscape architect to make sure that all this information was put together and analyzed before we started deciding where to put buildings. So I'm going to go through some case studies now. And there's nothing special about these examples. These are things that you've seen similar approaches, I'm sure. I think that it's possible that they've been done for longer in the US and Canada. And there might be more projects generally in the US and Canada than here, simply because this has been quite common practice as long as I've been in landscape architecture and well before that too, I think. So some major differences. I'm sure I don't have to tell you that we have a lot more space in America. But I do think that a lot of these approaches can be done in small spaces too. So I don't necessarily think that's a constraint. So I'm going to show you some examples now. These first slides are from a friend of mine who is a civil engineer and is very knowledgeable about kind of these processes and soft engineering of a site. So there are some great examples of allied professionals that I've worked with who, and here as well, who are very good at.
Excuse me, Claudia, there are a
Yep.
couple of grey boxes obscuring part of your presentation, one at the top and one to the right-hand side. I don't know if there's anything
Not on
you can
mine.
do about that. Okay,
No, I'm sorry. It's
maybe a
very
problem
strange.
with Zoom.
Could
Sorry
be,
to have
yeah. Sorry
interrupted
about
you.
that. No, that's okay. Yeah, I'm not seeing it, so I don't know what's happening with that. But if I need to go back and show anything in more detail because of that, I'm happy to at the end. Just let me know. So at any rate, these examples are good because they really show an integration of the different kind of principles of design. So this one in particular, I think, or this one to begin with, we see that the existing trees have been retained. We see a nice pedestrian connectivity. We see a bioswale in the middle of a residential development that's well integrated and very attractive and well maintained. So the client obviously bought into this. And same with this one. So we have a little footbridge even across a swale, and in front of housing. And in this particular case, the planting palette is quite simple. And I'm sure that's for maintenance reasons. They've just chosen some low growing palm trees or shrubs, palm shrubs and mulch. But it's perfectly functional as a bioswale. So these kind of pocket wetlands can be inserted into developments in very small spaces and function quite well as an overall strategy for attenuating the water on the site. Stream restoration. Here I have to point out one of the negatives about this kind of process in the States, which is that tree protection is not always the first thing on people's minds. Sometimes the landscape architect is able to convince them to do so, but sometimes not. And so in this case, you can see that these tree root ends are probably being impacted by this restoration of the stream. And although this is a more urban park example of a stream restoration, and I am a little bit concerned about basketballs bouncing into that ditch, but at any rate, it is a good example of kind of integrating several different things into a site. So the engineer that I spoke to about these images said that basically landscape architects were involved in every step of the process, from design development right up to construction. And so this really allows us to have that kind of marriage and integration between the technical and the aesthetic design features. And we can bring so much to a project in terms of looking after the well-being of the site, the open space, the pedestrian and cycling connectivity, making sure that the ecological concerns are addressed, because sometimes ecologists are brought in and sometimes they're not, and often they're brought in late. And so if landscape architects are involved early on, we do have a high level understanding of some of those ecological needs, and we can address things first on site. And then we can also, when need be, if there isn't an ecologist appointed, maybe we make sure that one is, or that we have consultants brought in who need to address something more serious with regards to the site. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about some case studies. This is a friend of mine who works for the City of Tampa, Florida, and I probably don't have to tell you that Florida gets a lot of hurricanes. So this is a pretty dramatic example of some of the flooding from a hurricane in Tampa. This particular year, and this is just this year, they had a 5-inch in 1 hour storm in July, and then the two hurricanes that came right after were back to back, Helen and Milton. And so it's pretty desperate situation in terms of flooding in Florida. And it's an onslaught that never stops year after year. So obviously stormwater management is very important to them. So one of these, the City of Tampa has done this kind of major project to try to mitigate some of the effects of these storms. And I think something that they did was very smart was and very interesting was that they actually mapped the complaints from people within the city about flooding. So rather than just looking at modeling and where we think flooding could happen, they actually looked at where it did happen. And so taking those maps into consideration, along with other data, they came up with this proposal for an integrated master plan for a local open space within the city. And this project is very multidisciplinary. So they're dealing with habitat restoration, kind of trying to bring nature and well-being to the residents around there, attenuation and water treatment for the water that's coming through, pedestrian and cycling connectivity. And then very interestingly, they're actually updating the infrastructure within that area as well, so that both the water and sewer lines will be upgraded and made to be better, higher functioning. So this really takes a lot of joined up thinking. But the thing about it is when you can wrap so many benefits up into one project, you can really get some heavy funding because you're kind of, I hate this analogy, but killing a lot of birds with one stone. So we don't want to kill any birds, but this is definitely bringing together a lot of different needs and benefits into one project. And so this is done through public-private partnerships, which I've noticed happen quite a bit more in the States than they do over here. So just kind of looking at the different procedures between the two. If you look at the US, I do think there's more kind of local and state level projects and funding for projects, and it's less top down. There seems to be better cooperation between the different entities when trying to build these kind of partnerships for funding, as in the last example. And some of the cons are that there's much less of a focus on kind of environmental factors like climate change and biodiversity and that sort of thing. In fact, I worked for a city county planning department in South Carolina for 7 years. And one of our policies was we were not allowed to mention anything regarding climate change in any of our documents. So it's a real barrier. And the political barriers within the states, I probably don't have to tell you, are pretty extreme, and there's a lot of division. So believe it or not, that is definitely a pro in the UK. The politics here are much less divided. And I haven't heard anybody politically within the political sphere say that climate change isn't real or and every time I've been involved in consultation over here, people always are very interested in biodiversity and climate change, and all these things are important to people because they've been educated through our media here and maybe through politics as well, that these are things that we need to look at and we need to take care of. So I'm not saying we are there. We definitely have things we need to do to change the situation here, but that main barrier is not here, which is of just making people aware of it and that people actually believe in it. So people in the UK also, and politically, I think this is true, care about things like tree protection, kind of the views are important. LVAs and LVIAs are a thing here, much more so than in the States. So landscape character is important here. And I think that the REBA stages of work are a real benefit in the UK because they really help projects to be more efficient and help people to understand what their roles are within the project. So some of the cons I've noticed here, there's a lot of red tape. There's a lot of bureaucracy, and that can really be a big barrier to getting these projects through. So it's a double-edged sword, I suppose. You know, if you don't have that, I guess the fear is that things won't be protected and things will happen that shouldn't. But so it's finding that balance, I think, between the two sides of having regulations on the one hand, but then also of allowing things to occur so that you can make headway. And also the procurement process in the UK does not put the site and the landscape needs first. And I think that's something that needs to be examined. Of course, we're supposed to be getting a whole new way of procuring projects coming through, I believe, in February. So hopefully, fingers crossed, that will help address this issue. So just looking at kind of the differences between advocacy and education within the US and the UK. In the USA, universities are very involved. And, you know, for example, in University of Georgia, North Carolina State, and Clemson University, where I went, are all three state universities within the South that have extension services related to them. And those extension services are local community assets that are linked to the university and probably receive some funding from the university, but act locally to address things like water quality, for example. So this is a really good system for helping, you know, local farmers, for example, understand why they need to have best practices with their agricultural runoff, that sort of thing. So it's a real educational tool. And I also think that the ASLA, the American Society of Landscape Architects, does a really good job with advocacy. They have a presence in Washington that's strong, and at the state level too. They lobby heavily, not only for our profession but for environmental issues generally. So you find that landscape architects tend to be quite involved with their local ASLA. Not all of them, but a lot of them. More so than here. I think it's a strong kind of tribe of landscape architects that tend to really knit together and want to work together to try to promote some of these things. And often landscape architects are the people on projects who are educating everybody else about some of these principles. Some engineers are great, like the ones I've shown you images from, but a lot of them, you know, the old school engineers, they don't necessarily, they're not necessarily on board with some of these practices because that's not what they're used to. So a lot of times we're pushing for things and they want, you know, it's that same old argument. They want to see the numbers. They want to know how this is going to work. And you just kind of have to be a little bit assertive and really try to speak for these processes and for ecology generally and for tree protection generally, all these things. Landscape architects tend to do a lot of heavy lifting on sites. And so I'm well used to going out and measuring trees to find out which ones are in good shape and need to be retained on the site, and, you know, kind of nominally putting where they are on the site, because not every project can afford a tree survey. So you know, doing surveying with transit, I've done it, and trying to make sure that the levels are understood. So landscape architects are really very kind of generalists, I suppose, who go in and do a lot of things on the site first that then may or may not be done in more detail by other consultants later, depending on the size of the budget and that sort of thing. Another thing in the US that I think is a benefit is that we have a title restriction there. So I was not allowed to call myself a landscape architect until I had been through an accredited program, had a degree, and then worked in South Carolina, where I was at the time. I had to have worked under a landscape architect who was licensed for 2 years. And I had to take a 4-part, very difficult test that covered everything from contracts to grading and drainage. So it's it's not easy to become a landscape architect. You have to go through all of that first. And so I think that's a real benefit to our profession and to getting the kind of the respect that we deserve for what we can do. So in the UK, there are universities that are starting to take a lead in these things. Sheffield's a great example. I do think the Landscape Institute could do more in terms of advocacy and lobbying for our profession and standing up for us. And I think landscape architects are just brought in way too late on a lot of projects. And this is partially because of the procurement process, and also because of the lack of understanding about what we can do. You know, we're just seen as the people who put the shrubs in, and it's just, it's selling us so short. And there's no title restriction for landscape architects in the UK, unfortunately, or engineers for that matter, which was shocking to me. I had someone come to my house when I first moved over here to repair the stove, and they were an engineer, and I was like, "What?" You know, I didn't understand. So it really, I think, cuts down on our the amount of respect that we gain as a profession because of that. So now I want to talk about kind of how can we put the landscape first on the agenda, not just in meetings, but generally, and landscape architects, how can we bring our profession to the front? And what can we do to improve this process in the UK? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you so much, Claudia. That was absolutely fascinating. And I hope I speak for everyone in saying the photographs of those woodlands in the fall were just stunning. We have one question in the chat so far from M. Collinson. I'm sorry, I don't know your first name. Could you unmute yourself and ask your question to Claudia, please?
Oh, hello. Can you hear me?
I can. Thank you very much.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, sorry. I'm just curious. I'd come across the idea of planning for managing water, something called a keyline plan approach, which was an old sort of Australian approach with Pia humans, which is kind of quite popular in sort of permaculture circles and things like that. I wondered if you'd come across the approach and whether it was significant within your sort of discipline or as an
Come
approach.
across it, but I've written it down now.
Yeah, I just wondered whether it was a marginal or a sort of a popular approach or
I've
concept.
heard of it, but I will definitely look into it.
Yeah, I don't know whether it's necessarily that different, but yeah, I mean, really, it's just about looking at water management across a landscape with respect to the contours of the land and how to hold water. I was just curious as to whether it was well known or not. I don't know that it's particularly special or particularly different, like I say, but yeah, I was interested to know. Yeah, okay.
I'll look into it.
Thank you.
And I think that actually cuts to the heart of this whole discussion, because, and I hope people will correct me if I'm wrong, I get the impression that that grey infrastructure architects look at a site and they go, "Well, this is pretty much a flat sheet of paper, and I can adjust the levels to suit." Whereas in Wales, with our new sustainable drainage regulations, we now have to think about, well, how are we going to drain this site using natural systems? And yeah, we're specifically excluded from using pumps unless there's a massively huge reason to do so. So I get the impression that we need landscape architects because they have the innate understanding of landform, and landform is sculpted by water. So am I getting this completely wrong? I'd love to hear from the floor. Let's get your perspective first, Claudia. What do you think?
But I think that landscape architects are in a position to be the leaders, and in a lot of this, I think, you know, it sort of takes a bit of gumption And sort of a willingness to lean in a bit. I think, you know, having sort of the confidence and wherewithal in a meeting to say, you know, to speak up and to say that the needs of the site have to be addressed, and sort of not let ourselves be pushed aside and anymore marginalized, because it's not just about our profession. It's not just about the fact that we deserve that or something like that, but it's also because we are in a real crisis. This is a really serious moment that we're in, and if we don't step up and try to lead, I'm worried that, you know, things are just not going to ever change. I think that the approaches that we've taken to development have to change, and we are the ones who are placed to try to help manifest that. That's what I think. But maybe I'm pushy because I'm American. I'm not sure.
Well, I'm not a landscape architect, but I would love to see landscape architects with their unique professional mindset play a central role in delivery of SUDS. And I wonder, do we have, yes, we've got Kate here who hopefully can speak on behalf of Landscape Institute Wales branch. Kate, what's your perspective on how landscape architects could get more involved in SUDS delivery, SUDS design?
Yeah, I was kind of holding back, letting other people. But yes, I thank you, Pete, for organising this, and Claudia, of course, for speaking. Yeah, we sort of want to sort of start a conversation, don't we, with people? I suppose it's from my perspective. So I chair the Wales branch of the LI, but I definitely echo Claudia's sentiments about the Landscape Institute, as a whole, sort of promoting our strengths and our skills, and having a louder voice in the room. I think what you say, Claudia, about the cultural maybe differences in, you as an American perhaps find it easier to speak out about these things, and I think sometimes the British sort of approach can be a bit too polite, if I'm being critical about my own approach. And I think landscape architects, we're quite a polite profession, unfortunately. I mean, that's a nice thing, obviously, but it sometimes doesn't help us sometimes. I think in Wales, I think this is I see the opportunity because of the SAB process, and other things as well in policy, and obviously there's already things happening, particularly in Cardiff. There's been some great work already done. I feel like we need to sort of shout more about that, and the building with nature standards, which I always bang on about. I'm an assessor for building with nature as well, and sustainable drainages and water management is a really important part of that framework. The sort of more recent versions of PPW, Planning Policy Wales, do actually reference the building with nature standards, and particularly, in the production of green infrastructure statements. So I think we're going in the right direction. It's sort of trying to bring it all together and make sure that as a profession, we're the ones who are at the forefront of that, and very much, again, it's being brought in at the right time, isn't it? That's critical, and I think, obviously with our colleagues, our friends in ecology, that they are thankfully being brought in much earlier, but we need to make sure that we're at the same stage and at the same table, as it were, at that point in the project. So I haven't necessarily answered your question, Pete. I've just rambled.
So I've got a question for you and for all the landscape architects on the webinar at the moment. How would a developer know that a landscape architect or their practice was qualified to design SUDS from the word go?
Yeah, That's a good question. And that's the critical bit, isn't it? It's the qualification bit. We don't necessarily have that formal, label for SUDS skills. And that's probably what we need to start looking at. I'm just thinking now, the Landscape Institute, competency framework. I'm pretty sure sustainable drainage will be featured in there somewhere, but I think it's bringing that forward a bit more and having those conversations at the earlier stage in education. Not waiting until pathway chartership, stage of people's career. It's catching people earlier, but also maybe looking at other ways to deliver. Of course, there are some training courses already out there, but it's perhaps getting that, sort of real kind of, maybe it's LI stamp on it or other, I don't know.
We've got
Robert?
a question from Robert. Robert, before I bring Claudia in, would you like to ask your question? Please unmute yourself so we can hear you. Robert, you're still on mute. Okay, still can't hear you, Robert. So would you mind typing your question into the chat? And
there's also sometimes a glitch where if you unraise your hand, it might allow you to unmute. I don't know if that's a thing, but I've seen that happen before.
Well, that's worth knowing. Zoom does seem to be very glitchy this morning.
Kate, thank you for that. I was trying, but it just wasn't allowing me. Look, just nothing of great substance really, other than to say that I've been involved in a planning application over the last 10, 11 months, frankly. And there has been a 30% increase or enhancement in green infrastructure on the site. That's been achieved by a landscape architect working in tandem with a hydrologist, vis-a-vis SUDS, SAB, all that stuff. So I just wanted to make that observation.
Yeah, that's really good. Thank you, Robert. I just for a minute, I thought I'd mention the years ago, this was 2010, I believe, because I graduated with my MLA in 2009. It was right after that. I went through a 3-day training workshop on LID and received the NC-LID certification and a little stamp because of it. And so maybe something similar to that could be designed within the UK for landscape architects and civil engineers to participate in. And actually, I think bring other allied professionals in for something like that would be really beneficial for both of us and would help us understand that we need to work together, and possibly hydrologists too. I think it shouldn't be limited by discipline. I think it should be limited to people or welcoming to people who are dealing with these issues on sites.
That is an absolutely fascinating suggestion. We've got a minute and a half left in this bit of the webinar. We can dial back in again afterwards, but this is something that I think we should definitely pursue with the Landscape Institute and allied professions, so that people who have a baseline training in either drainage engineering or landscape architecture can then get specific accreditation. Gary from Social Farms and Gardens, can you unmute yourself? You've got a minute in which to ask your question and then for somebody to answer it.
Thanks, Pete. Hopefully this will work. I'm in the car, I'm afraid, today. Interesting question that we've got a planning application in as well, obviously going through SUDS and SAB approval. We found hopefully a very good, let's say, specialist around SUDS, contractor specialist, designed our SUDS application around their advice, but obviously then you submit your sort of pre-app into the SAB team and they make sort of comments, questions or challenge you. And I was just pondering over, you pay a lot of money for some very good specialists that hopefully have done their qualifications and done their job, but people differ in opinions, don't they? And we have to go with what the SAB team tell us, obviously, but yeah, just I was literally just sort of pondering that. We talk about getting people qualified and trained, but ultimately the SAB team will make the decisions, I suppose.